As a Ferrari fan, it pains me to say this, but the Scuderia sucks this year. The Ferrari SF1000 is slow, down on power, aerodynamically inferior, and all-round rubbish. Charles Leclerc is doing the best he can with the car, and at the time of writing this, he has already picked up 2 podiums. However, it's nothing compared to the race-winning pace he had last year. It also doesn't help that Sebastian Vettel confirmed he was leaving the team before the season even started. Not to mention that Ferrari's pit stop strategies have been notoriously abysmal these last few years. Overall, it's a terrible team dynamic at the moment. Actually, I made a video on this over on JWF1's channel not that long ago, link in the description. I can already see that the Ferrari fans are starting to give up on this year, but if you think this is bad, allow me to present the 1980 Formula 1 season. The Ferrari 312T platform had proven itself to be a very good race car. Between the time it was introduced in 1975 and the end of the 1979 season, it produced 4 Constructors' Championships, 3 Drivers' Championships, 27 race wins, 61 podiums, and 19 pole positions. These feats had been achieved by drivers such as Niki Lauda, Gilles Villeneuve, Jody Scheckter, and Carlos Reutemann. Having achieved a driver's title for Scheckter and taking home the Constructors' Championship in 1979, Ferrari was sitting pretty going into the new decade, and on the basis that there was no replacement for displacement, Ferrari stuck with their famous flat 12 for the latest version of their car, the 312 T5. However, there was a problem. In 1977, Lotus began making use of ground effect with the Lotus 78, something that gave them a significant competitive advantage over the rest of the field. Ferrari had made some headway in improving their aerodynamic performance in 1979, and were probably saved by streaks of unreliability from Lotus, the fact that other teams hadn't quite caught up with the development of ground effect yet, and their horsepower advantage. But by 1980, the other teams were really starting to catch up, and horsepower alone was not going to be enough to keep the Ferraris ahead. One of the major issues was their aerodynamic performance. Now, to understand why this was such a major issue, you first need to understand what ground effect is and why the Ferrari 312 T5 couldn't use it effectively. Here is Joe Donohue to explain.
Thank you, Jack. So the beginning stages of ground effects were obviously laden with small details being overlooked and lots of knowledge going unrecognized by engineers. Ferrari dropped the ball in 1980 with their design in terms of maximizing the abilities of the newfound technology and developing it further as the season progressed. Firstly, what is ground effect? As simply as possible, ground effect is a method of using air to create downforce from the underside of the car. Air travels through the small space below the monocoque at the front of the vehicle and travels backwards underneath it. As it does so, the bottom side of the car's body is sloped upwards, reserving space that creates vacuums of air. The same amount of air occupying a larger amount of space creates a low-pressure system. This is referred to as the Venturi effect. Because of this, the car is pulled downward from air pressure reduction, therefore increasing the stability and cornering speed of the car. As for 1980, most of the grid utilized the Ford DFV V8 engine, excluding 3 teams that supplied their own motors. Ferrari, being one of them, continued to use a 12-cylinder configuration, which occupies much more space than a V8. Generally speaking, more cylinders means larger overall engine size. Not only that, but their flat 12 boxer engine used had an increased planar area due to running the engine cylinders flat rather than angled to each other. Because of this, much more of the space where air channels could be under the car was taken up. The idea is the same as any other wing or aerodynamic component. Larger means more effect. Because more of the chassis area was taken up by engine space, Ferrari was missing out on crucial volume for air channels under the car to add downforce. Additionally, the team was unable to muster up any significant development over their season, which meant they continued to fall back as time progressed. The inability of the team to evolve with the needs of being competitive, both in terms of the oversized flat 12 and continuous perfection of their car, meant that they were at a significant disadvantage when the field lined up on track.
The other issue was reliability, but we'll get into that. At the opening race of the season in Argentina, Gilles Villeneuve would run well for most of the day and remain close to the leading Williams of Alan Jones. In fact, it was testament to how good Villeneuve actually was. He was pushing a car that really wasn't that great to the limit to take the fight to the Williams. However, on lap 36, while he was in second place, the suspension gave up, and he hit the wall hard. Scheckter would retire on lap 45 with engine troubles. In Brazil, Schechter's car gave up on lap 10. Villeneuve was reasonably competitive at the start of the race, but would fade as the race wore on, before his engine gave up on lap 36 as René Arnoux began his final lap on lap 40. Reliability issues were clearly proving to be one of Scuderia Ferrari's biggest issues in 1980, as South Africa would see another double retirement. At Long Beach, things would be a little better, with Scheckter scoring the team's first points of the season with a 5th place, while Villeneuve retired. Bear in mind, however, 5th was only worth 2 points at that time. Let's also not forget, at this same point in 1979, Ferrari had already taken 2 1-2 finishes, so 1980 was turning out to be pretty miserable by comparison. The Belgium Grand Prix would see Villeneuve scrape by to get another point while Scheckter finished 8th. He would then score another 2 points in Monaco while Scheckter retired. Come the French Grand Prix, qualifying was becoming an increasingly miserable affair, which would later become a major talking point, but we'll get to that. Not even Villeneuve could push the car into the top 10, and he and Scheckter qualified 17th and 19th respectively. Villeneuve would finish 8th while Scheckter would finish 12th, but really it was only because loads of cars retired. In fact, it was during this time that nearly 30 cars would start the race, but a little over 10 would see the checkered flag. Even less would finish on the lead lap. Still, no points in this race. It only got worse at the British Grand Prix, with Villeneuve starting 19th with Scheckter in 23rd. Scheckter would go on to finish 10th, while Villeneuve would retire. But even then, Scheckter was still 3 laps down. Villeneuve would grab another point at the German Grand Prix, while Scheckter would finish an uninspiring 13th. By the Austrian Grand Prix, the Ferrari's lack of car development was really starting to show, with Villeneuve and Scheckter qualifying 4.6 and 5.34 seconds off the pace respectively. The race wasn't exactly inspiring either, with both cars finishing outside the points and a lap down. Because the 312 T5 was so rubbish, a few races later at the Italian Grand Prix, Ferrari debuted its replacement, the 126 CK, although it was only being tested and they'd still use the 312 T5 for the race. Ferrari had more or less accepted at this point that this season was a complete bust, so it was refreshing for the team and the Tifosi to see next year's car setting competitive lap times. It was also at this race, after a crash in practice and an all-round miserable season, Jody Scheckter announced his retirement from Formula 1. The race would prove to be ultimately an underwhelming affair, as Villeneuve would crash out of the race after a tyre blew, while Scheckter would finish 8th. The Canadian Grand Prix would prove to be a serious low point. Remember when I said earlier in the video that qualifying was becoming an increasingly miserable affair? Yeah? Well, for one of the first and only times in Ferrari's history, while Villeneuve qualified a lowly 22nd, Scheckter failed to qualify. While Villeneuve would come in massively clutch during the race, finishing 5th and scoring points, it was still an incredibly embarrassing moment. The final race of the 1980 Formula 1 season was at Watkins Glen, and Scheckter would finish 11th and Villeneuve would retire due to a crash. That would be Schechter's last race in Formula 1. So Ferrari's season looked like this. Gilles Villeneuve was classified joint 10th in the drivers' standings on 6 points, with Jody Scheckter in 19th with 2. The constructors' standings would see Ferrari classified 10th on a grand total of 8 points, second last of the teams that scored points ahead of Alfa Romeo. The standings would see them finish behind teams such as Fittipaldi, a team that never finished higher than 7th in the Constructors' Championship, Arrows, who in their 24 years in Formula 1 had a best constructors finish of 5th. Interestingly, they were also beaten by McLaren, who also had a dreadful season with 11 points in the Constructors' Championship. To my knowledge, this was, and still is, Ferrari's single worst season in Formula 1, since they began racing full-time. However, while their season was terrible, it did contribute to cementing the legend of Gilles Villeneuve. Villeneuve continually impressed in an uncompetitive car and pushed it within an inch of its life. There are quite a few photos of Gilles pushing or sliding at car number 2, and I can only imagine it must have been incredible to watch. Villeneuve's best driver's title result came in 1979 with a second place, and over the course of his F1 career he took 6 wins. Unfortunately, he was killed in an accident in 1982, but his race wins and the way in which he was able to outperform a terrible car shows that he was definitely World Championship material. If anything, Charles Leclerc's performances are actually quite similar to what Gilles did in 1980, taking an underperforming Ferrari and making the absolute most of it, truly proving his skills. As previously mentioned, Ferrari would switch to an entirely new car for the coming season, the 126CK, and would do a lot better, and in 1982 actually won the Constructors' title, but they wouldn't win another driver's title until 2000 with Michael Schumacher. Although I must say, I am hoping I don't have to wait until I'm old and frail to see another Ferrari title. But anyway, I guess the point I'm trying to make is Ferrari would have dreamed of having the season they're having now in 1980. Anyway, before we wrap up today, I'd like to thank Joe for joining us today, and I'll give him a second now to plug his stuff.
Thank you, Jack. So, I'm Joe Donohue. My YouTube channel is simply Joe Donohue. I make one of only 2 IndyCar stop motion series here on YouTube. I also like to make stop motions for F1 and at drag racing, other types of fun stuff. I like to make video blogs from race weekends I attend as well, so people can see and enjoy them. I just like to share a good time with people who have the same interests as me. So with that, I also want to thank Jack for inviting me on to take part in this awesome video production.
And that's it. What do you think of today's video? Put all your thoughts in the comments below. I do actually read them all, so you may as well say something, and I'll most likely respond to you. All the socials are in the description below, including the TCR Instagram, Twitter, and Discord server, as well as my own personal Twitter. Please go check those links out if you haven't already done so. Anyway, like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.